Hey folks, Zach Osterman here, IU Insider Indianapolis Star. This is Mind Your Banners for January 7th, 2025. First Mind Your Banners of the new year. I'm sorry it's been a while. We have had we've had adventures. He's Mike Niziolek from the Bloomington Herald Times. We've had some disease adventures, we've had some snow adventures, we've had some travel adventures. How are you finding the new year?
I mean, it's simpler than yours. You had the travel adventures in the snow. I'm hoping it's a little better this weekend for Iowa.
Yeah. I mean, are you flying or driving?
Flying.
Okay, yeah. Yeah. I mean, it was at one point yesterday. I wasn't sure I was going to make it back yesterday either. But eventually I got back and the roads were fine. We're going to talk basketball and football today. Obviously, football will revolve around the portal, but I want to start with basketball. Since the last time we did one of these, Indiana has won all 4 of its games. 2 of those were, I would say, relatively unimpressive wins against Chattanooga and Winthrop. 2 of them I thought were more impressive wins against Rutgers and certainly against Penn State. Hoosiers are now 12-3. They're 3-1 in the Big Ten. I think they're up in the 50s, both in KenPom and I think also the net now. The big one is that Penn State game. The way Indiana kind of stays steady on, sort of through obviously not having Malik Renew, sort of struggling with just shot making in the first half. Umar Ballo kind of keeps Indiana afloat, and then there's just that burst after halftime that really sort of takes Indiana away, creates separation that Mike Woodson's team kind of uses to ride to the end. Just, listen, it's kind of weird to say it this way because we're talking about 4 games spaced out over like 3 weeks. But like, what do you make of what we've seen from Indiana, really since that Nebraska loss?
I don't know. It's just a team that's vexing, I guess I would say. Like, you don't really know, I think, night to night what you're going to get. I think some of the issues, Omar Ballo obviously missed a game, has come back, and then Malik Renew went down with an injury. So, I think there's, some questions there about, when do they get Malik back, and are they a better team with Malik sort of in the lineup? I know there's been a lot of discussion about that sort of with the one big now again, but just a team that's hard to sort of, Rutgers, I think you didn't mention that, they were without their best player in that win. So, that one, it was a win, but it was obviously, you're not playing Rutgers at full strength. I think that would have been a different game. But just a team that I don't know necessarily, what you're going to get night in and night out yet in Indiana.
Yeah, I think, to talk about that Rutgers game, obviously it's a very weird one. And Rutgers is a weird team. This is not like a Steve Peichel team. Steve Peichel's teams have typically been a lot more, sort of defense oriented, rebounded the ball well. This one obviously is younger. You talk about Dylan Harper didn't play in that game. On the other hand, if Dylan Harper had played and I told you Rutgers is going to get 39 points from Harper and Ace Bailey, I think that would have been pretty reasonable. But it was just kind of, I don't know. Rutgers is a funny team right now. Like, Bailey has the game that he has, 39 points on 29 shots, 8 rebounds, made some crazy shots in that game. But it felt like it happened just like almost in isolation to everything else that it didn't feel like Rutgers was doing anything with the way Ace Bailey was playing, if that makes sense. They were just sort of they were almost like spectators to his performance, but you didn't feel like that fed anything else that Rutgers was trying to do. Whereas I think it is fair to say you go back the other end. Obviously, Indiana hits a lot of threes. In that game, hits 12 threes, most since North Alabama last year. Isn't that what you figured out?
Yeah.
But, on the other hand, 16 assists to just 8 turnovers. The right guys are taking those threes. Of Indiana's 27 attempts, 18 are Mackenzie Mbako, Trey Galloway, and Luke Goody. 4 players in double figures in scoring. Again, if we're talking about Dylan Harper not playing, and we can maybe have the conversation about the one big versus two big lineups with Indiana, but Malik Reneau also plays a grand total of about 30 seconds in that game before he goes down with his knee injury, leg injury, kind of whatever it is. It was just a funny game. And, Ken Pom has Indiana's minimum win probability throughout the course of the entire game at 53%. So, like, for all of what do we make of Indiana without Reneau, of Rutgers without Harper, of the way Ace Bailey played and all that, there's really never a point where Indiana was in a ton of danger of losing that game. And I think there's something interesting that happens in that game, and really even more so in the Penn State game, is we start to see Indiana score in bursts. The Penn State game is kind of a better example. There's that stretch of basically like less than 2 minutes where Indiana goes on like a 12-0 run. Or I think it was 12-0. They started that half 15-4. And, a lot of it is just kind of that burst from Mackenzie Mbako, who goes on kind of his own personal 8-0, sort of, kind of slug. But I saw that and I just thought it had been a while since I'd seen an Indiana team that could score that quickly, like in bunches like that, like that could, just boom, boom, boom. Suddenly it's an 11-0 run, and Trace Jackson Davis's teams could do that a little bit, but those would happen almost kind of over the course of a few minutes, like driving a tank across a field. It would happen kind of at its own pace. You just couldn't stop it. But it wasn't like you could just get overwhelmed with Indiana offensively in a stretch where suddenly the game's tied and then boom, you're down 12. And there was a little bit of that in Rutgers, but there was a lot more in that Penn State game. And I thought that was interesting to me, because it does feel like maybe it contributes something to the wider idea that this team is developing some identity, some clarity of roles. Guys are maybe understanding a little bit better how and where they fit into the firmament of this team. I just thought it was interesting.
But isn't that alternatively a sign of a streaky team? I mean, we've seen that before from Mackenzie Mbako. I think we've seen this from his team sort of early in the non-conference schedule, that we know that when they're shooting well, what they're capable of, especially particularly Mackenzie Mbako, but it's the sort of the roller coaster, that the idea that they go 12 of 27 from three against Rutgers, 9 of 23, which is a good day for them, almost shooting 40% against Penn State. The 2 games prior, 6 of 40 combined, and Mackenzie Mbako, I think that one of those was his worst game as in college. And then I think Miles Rice has sort of been on that roller coaster, where I think we haven't really gotten a firm answer from. I think the best way Mike Woodson sort of attempted to describe it is that he's playing, still trying to figure out the pace at which he can go with the rest of the teammates, and having sort of trouble balancing pushing the ball versus not. But he's been sort of up and down. Omar Ballo, certainly was great, the last 2 games, but effort's been sort of an issue there. It just, to me, the scoring outbursts aren't a sign of like this team's figured it out. It's that, like, look, we know what this team's capable of when it's on, but it's just there's so many off periods that it's hard to sort of say like they're going to beat good teams here coming up.
Well, I guess my question is, does a game like Penn State, and I think in fairness, Penn State's a good team. I mean, Penn State's
they had a really bad night. I mean, they had a bad night though too. I mean, I think we should point out they were 3 of 21 from 3-pointer. They make 2 of those, the game's tied.
I mean, I don't know. Like that feels a little bit generous. Like I thought.
They had the ball to make it a 1-possession game with less than 2 minutes to go.
Substantially outplayed Penn State, particularly in the crucial periods of that second half.
They missed their last.
Either way, the point is that's a Penn State team that is in the NCAA tournament conversation. Its only other losses were away to Rutgers by 4, and on a neutral floor to Clemson, which is another NCAA tournament team as of right now, or in that conversation certainly by 8. That's a Penn State team that is historically very tough to beat at the Palestra. They play very well when they play there. They took Purdue to the wire there. In recent years, they've beaten Michigan State there. They beat Michigan there. I think they beat Iowa there a couple of years ago. It's a Penn State team that right now Ken Pom has winning 20 games and going 10-10 in conference. That probably gets them into the tournament when you consider the wins that they would pick up in the Big Ten, although they do, they have kind of a weird draw in the Big Ten. Like they play Minnesota twice. They play Washington. They get basically a little bit weaker. They play Rutgers twice. So they get a little bit of the weaker end of the Big Ten, but that's not a bad team. Rutgers right now is not a very good team, and certainly not.
Well, I guess I meant the.
I just say, like, when you say, like, is it going to hold up when they play better teams? I mean, I think Penn State's a better team than Indiana right now, and Indiana beat Penn State in what the committee has generally treated as a road game.
But would you say Indiana needs 3 to 4 wins against top tier 1 type of to get in the tournament here down the stretch? I mean, the last 2 months and a half, and like,
what is tier 1? Like, what are we defining that as?
I mean, what are the?
Are you talking about quad 1 wins?
Yeah, I mean quad 1 wins.
So let me get that. I'm getting the net rankings up right now because in the NCAA net rankings will also pull together. So Indiana's 56th in the net. They're 2-3 against quads 1 and 2. They have a quad 1 win and a quad 2 win. I'm guessing the quad 2 win is, I think, South Carolina. My search function is not working very well here. Anyway, the point is they don't have much. I mean, I think to feel comfortable in the tournament conversation, you need to be in a situation where I think the quad 2 win is Providence. Yeah, I think it's Providence on the road, or not on the road, but on a neutral floor. I think to feel comfortable in a tournament setting, like you're not in the you're not in the bubble or anything like that, because it's worth saying, Indiana did get out of its non-conference unscathed from a quad 3, quad 4 perspective. Now, they didn't do a lot to help their analytics, but they at least don't have like a bad loss sort of pulling them down as of right now. We'll see what happens with a Louisville. We'll see what happens, with a Nebraska. I think Indiana probably needs to be in a place where it has like 8 to 10 quad 1 and 2 wins. I think that's, and they've got 2 right now. Now, of course, you've got a lot of opportunities coming up, right? Once Indiana gets the other side of USC, every other team they play except Washington is ranked in the top 60 in Ken Pom. And the 2 lowest ranked teams other than Washington still on the schedule, they play on the road in Iowa and Northwestern. So those would be acceptable losses, and they would be higher quality wins because they'd come on the road rather than at home. The point is they're going to have a lot of opportunities. I don't think, I think Joe Lunardi, and I have a rule of thumb that I just don't do bracketology until after Valentine's Day because there's just too much to sort of unfold or unpack. But I think I saw a tweet run across my timeline that Lunardi has it in the first 4 out. So they're in that conversation, the bubble conversation right now, I think. They still have quite a bit of work to do. I guess my point is more, when you watched them play Chattanooga and Winthrop, you thought, man, this is a team that could really sort of fumble into the new year. And instead, they beat Rutgers through a generational shooting performance from Ace Bailey. And then they went on the road and beat, again, I think a Penn State team that's probably a little bit better than they are right now. One that certainly had better wins coming into this game. And, they never trailed through the entire second half of that game. So that gives you, I think, some hope that maybe this team is capable of, sort of carrying that performance forward, not just against a USC, but maybe at Iowa, maybe at Ohio State or Northwestern.
Yeah, but I guess I never thought, I always thought that they were capable of that because the talent alone. I don't know that these wins sort of answered any questions necessarily for me that, unless, when they're playing well on paper, they're a really talented team.
Well, but doesn't it by nature answer the question if you see them play well? Because the thing is, we've seen them not play well. We've seen what it looks like when, yes, they have all the talent in the world, but it doesn't.
But they had these games like South Carolina. They had a game like the Penn State game against South Carolina Like, I mean, I thought I mean, we've seen what it looks like when the team's clicking. Like, I don't know. I think that they need to play steadier basketball for 40 minutes and have some of these guys level out, or they're just going to be up and down like this the rest of the season. Like, I don't think you can go. I mean, when you look at Mackenzie Mbako's season, and I think he's sort of a kind of a key piece here, because I think when he's scoring, 15 to 20 points confidently a game, hitting multiple 3-pointers, this is a different team. But, based on the week this year, it's like he's just been a different player. And I think Miles Rice has been the same way. I don't think this team's leveled out in a way that you could say you have confidence that they'll be able to carry this forward for multiple weeks yet. I think we've seen these flips.
I'm not saying, like, I don't know what my degree of confidence would be. I just like for example, you say like Miles Rice has been a little uneven, but like in Indiana's last 5 games, I'd argue he's only played poorly in one of them. And that was the Chattanooga game when he still had 3 rebounds and 3 assists, but he only had 4 points. The other 4 of those 5 games, Rice had 20 points and 3 rebounds, only with 1 assist, but 4 steals in Nebraska. He had 18 points, 4 rebounds, and 3 assists and 3 steals against Winthrop. He had 23, 5, 3, and 2 against Rutgers. And then he only has 9 points against Penn State. But, like, that's kind of what a point guard does sometimes, because he also has 4 assists to just 2 turnovers between him. And I think this was one of the pieces that stood out for me was between Rice and Trey Galloway, 17 points, 10 assists, 6 rebounds, and only 4 turnovers. That says that like the guard play is a stabilizing force to me. Now, I agree with you about Mackenzie Mbako. I do think if you're Indiana, you're encouraged by the way both he and Luke Goody are shooting the ball. Goody started the season 5 of 20 from behind the arc, which means he's 18 of 46 since. He's 9 of 21, which I recognize is not an enormous number, but like in 4 conference games, he's taking about 5 threes a game, and he's hitting almost 43% of them. So basically, Luke, you can feel comfortable that the Luke Goody you thought you were signing from Illinois, both in terms of volume and accuracy, is kind of beginning to come back into form. I think there's still some other questions too. Mike Woodson himself has said he's got to find a way to get his bench more comfortable. Indiana only scores 3 bench points and only posts 5 bench rebounds and 2 bench assists on Sunday against Penn State. I think Bryson Tucker still has, the ups and downs that a lot of freshmen do. Indiana's clearly still fighting for, some consistency from Cannon Carlisle. Like he's clearly still looking for that. I'm not suggesting this team is by any means the finished article. I just think I'm seeing some of these building blocks that and Penn State is the one that I think is the game that gave me this sense the most. I'm starting to see some of this get put into place, and it's starting to make a little bit more sense to me. Now, I think this leads into a conversation that we probably need to have. And Mike Woodson said that he doesn't really know when Malik Renew will be back. I would point out that he says that pretty consistently with his injured players. He doesn't give timelines out very often, unless it's like a really long-term thing and he can just sit there and say like he's going to be out for quite a while. He doesn't tend to sort of ascribe timelines to this stuff very much. But I don't think it's completely unreasonable to ask the question of like the 1 big versus 2 big thing, because like, for example, on Sunday in that Penn State game, I think so much of the reason why it does make sense is because Indiana is only playing 1 big, which means that it's not hard for Indiana to find the space necessary for 2 guards and also 2 wings to operate on the floor together. And obviously, you need another big game from Umar Bala. I think he played 32 minutes in each of these games. He had 17 and 12 against Rutgers. He had 25 and 13 plus 2 blocks against Penn State. So you need Ballo playing well. That goes without saying. But like, I do.
Well, you mentioned Luke Goody. Some of his successes come in the starting lineup. The last 2 games, he's had 3 3-pointers. He's gone 6 of 10. and he's been having starters minutes. He's been able to get in sort of a rhythm, which he was obviously struggling a little bit off the bench to do.
And the other thing too is, and I don't want to make this conversation is not meant to be critical of any one player so much as just to ask, like, what's the best way for Indiana to go about deploying its lineup.
It's to be a fit for their roster, not necessarily a question of it's not insulting to say Malik Renew maybe doesn't fit as well with what the ceiling of the
what I was about to say, or what I was about to point out, is part of the conversation, part of the defining characteristic of this conversation in the offseason or preseason was this works if Malik Renew's offensive game continues to expand. It hasn't. He took 45 threes last season. He's only taken in 33 games. He's only taken 17 in 14 games this season. He was 15 of 45 from three last year, which is for a four is a perfectly solid number. He's only 3 of 17 this year. On the other hand, he's scoring at a career rate from an efficiency perspective on twos. He's shooting 67% on twos. Admittedly, obviously, he's basically played 2 conference games plus the 1 possession. But I mean, he was 10 of 13 on twos through 2 conference games this season. He's rebounding the ball, roughly as well as he has at any point in his career. But I think the problem you have if you're Indiana is to really feel like you're getting the most out of the 2 big lineups. And that's not just the 2 of them, but within the context of a team that should be able to shoot it a little better, to spread the floor a little bit more, etc. You've got one of them has to be able to operate away from the basket a little bit more. And ultimately, that's not going to be Oumar Ballo. Obviously, it needed to be Malik Renew. And when he's been healthy, it hasn't been. And then when you see Indiana plug in, in Renew's place, essentially, Luke Goody, Indiana's putting together some of the most efficient offensive performances of its season. Indiana's 21 of 50 from behind the arc in the last 2 games. If you look at their adjusted game-by-game efficiency numbers, the only high major teams against whom they have been more efficient offensively on a per-possession basis, again, adjusted, but this is KenPom numbers, have been Minnesota, which is just frankly a bad team, and South Carolina, where I think Indiana, played well in that game, but that game is also, those numbers are skewed by how many free throws Indiana shoots, in the sense that that's not, they get credit for making the free throws, but that's not reflective of the efficiency of the system working so much as just Indiana taking advantage of a lot of free points, boosting their efficiency numbers. Against decent competition, Indiana really has, I guess the only other real comparison is Providence that Indiana's looked this efficient against. And then the other piece of it too, that's been fascinating, because Indiana has in theory been playing smaller, they've been rebounding the ball better, quite frankly. Opponents have not hurt them quite as much rebounding the ball. Rutgers certainly didn't. But, Indiana's single game offensive rebound rates, these are 2 of the top 4 this season. Against Rutgers, they had something obscene, like 35 or 36 second chance points. My point is, they're not even necessarily giving up a lot when they go away from that size. And so I just think I don't think it's an unfair conversation to have. Not that necessarily, as you say, one of these players is, worse than the other or deserves criticism over the other, just that the overall process might work better with only one of them on the floor at a time most of the time.
Sorry, I'm having some streaming issues. I'm switching my
You look good from here. No, now you're fuzzy again. Anyway, I'll vamp while you figure out your streaming. No, I mean, it's a difficult conversation to have. And I think, again, the other piece of this is I'd argue you've probably, and none of this happens in a vacuum. Maybe this is part of the reason why, but I would argue you've gotten two of Umar Ballo's best games of the season in these last two. I think the only other one that really compares, adjusted for competition, is how well he plays against Gonzaga when he has 25 points, 4 rebounds, and 4 assists. But, in these last two games, 42 points, if I'm doing my math right, 25 rebounds, 5 assists, and 5 blocks. When your big is playing that well, that makes the idea of only one, sort of anchor post player on the floor make a lot more sense.
Sorry, I was dealing with some streaming issues. Now I got it back up. My question was going to be, after what you were saying, what's the solution? Like, what do you mean? Mike Woodson doesn't seem like he, is inclined to go away from Renew when he's back. How do you thread that needle?
I mean, hold on. I need to text my wife.
Fighting kids?
No.
Who's winning?
The cat. It's the cats.
Give us a play-by-play. Oh, no, it's not. It's the cats. Which cat's winning? Which cat's winning?
Who knows? If you go to, and this is going to be affected in part by the fact that Malik Renew has not been healthy for the last 2 games. But if you actually go to Ken Palm's most frequent lineups over the last 5 games, Renew and Ballo are only on the floor together in one of them, which surprised me that it was that little. And again, I know some of that is affected.
Ballo missed a game too.
Yeah. So I know some of that is affected by injuries and the imbalance there, but you're still. I mean, like the second most common one is actually Mackenzie Mbako at the 4 and Langdon Hatton at the 5, which again is kind of a function of the injuries. But then, like I guess what I'm trying to say is there's an extent to which it seems like whether it is happening organically because of health issues right now, and will continue to as long as Malik Renew is sidelined, obviously.
Right, but when he gets back, how do you?
The point I'm trying to make is, if you're Mike Woodson, I don't think you can ignore this data that you're getting.
So you're saying keep one of them, keep. I mean, because Malik can't play the 5, right? So Malik gets less minutes. Is that the solution?
I think you can play Malik Renew at the 5 in stretches. Maybe not as long as you can Umar Ballo, but I think you can do it in stretches when you're making when you are making a conscious choice to be smaller. And that will be opponent dependent too, right? Like, I mean, you can probably do that against, for example, an Iowa, where, and I mean, we don't know if Malik Renew will be healthy by the Iowa game. My sense would be it's more likely than not he won't be, but you might be able to do that more against an Iowa when Malik Renew can match up with Owen Freeman than you would against a team that's going to play a little bit bigger, like when Maryland is here in about 3 weeks. Derek Queen comes into town, and Julian Reese and all that. But if you're Mike Woodson, I don't think you can avoid or ignore how much more it has just all seemed to kind of make sense when Indiana's played smaller. But I think the one advantage of having some time here where you have been forced to play smaller is you kind of are learning to do it on the fly, if you know what I'm saying. Like you kind of can sort of start to feel like you're adapting it into your identity, I guess. And then when Malik Renew comes back, then maybe you need to have a conversation about, does he play off the bench? Or at very least, if he goes back into the starting lineup, do those lineups get chopped up a little bit more or a little bit differently? I just think we
haven't seen. I mean, Woodson does not change on the fly necessarily. unless he has to, right? Like, I mean, I don't think we've seen a lot, with lineups and things like that. He has a very sort of systematic way of viewing things. And I'm just curious when Renew comes back, if he'll sort of value the data as much as you are and sort of say, like, this is how it needs to be, versus trying to make it work because he thinks he can with just Renew and Balo at the same time in the lineup.
The last thing I want to talk about, and I mean, I don't want to go like absolutely crazy on this, but the last thing basketball wise that I want to talk about is kind of basically what's immediately in front of Indiana. And I would essentially say the next 6 games, 3 of them are at home, 3 of them are on the road. You got USC at home, Maryland at home. Right now, Indiana's, according to KenPom, favored against USC and a coin toss against Maryland. You got an Illinois team on the road that, when you talk about some quality wins, obviously road wins just tend to weight differently than wins at home. But like, Illinois is about as good as anybody probably Indiana can beat, home or away, on the schedule from this point in. Like, they're the highest ranked team in the conference per Ken Pomeroy right now at number 11. So I think that's
I think they scored 250. I think they scored 250 points against Oregon based on tweets I saw online.
Which tweets? Which tweets specifically? Where they from?
Illinois put up some points against Oregon.
And then you got 3 road games that, like, I don't think Indiana will win all 3, but like, in isolation, I think Indiana can win any of them. Iowa, Ohio State, Northwestern. And, if you got 6 games here before you start a gauntlet that goes Purdue, Wisconsin, Michigan, Michigan State, UCLA, Purdue again. That is going to be a really difficult stretch of the season. There is a little bit of this 6-game stretch takes Indiana to the halfway mark of its Big Ten, of its Big Ten season or its Big Ten schedule. It does feel a little bit like there's an element of sort of making hay while the sun shines here, in terms of, if you're Indiana and you can find your way to like 4-2 in this stretch, virtually any game other than maybe USC at home you win is going to be a quality win. It's going to set you up to attack this back half of the Big Ten schedule looking for opportunities rather than feeling the pressure of having to get certain wins. It just feels like this is the opportunity Indiana has, because that stretch, starting with Purdue away on January 31st through Purdue at home on February 23rd, is incredibly difficult. It feels like Indiana's kind of got to make the most of some of this improved play.
So 4-2, like, you got to put a record on it if you're going to say make the most of it.
4-2. I 5-1 to me would kind of be shooting the moon. I don't think I think Indiana can win any of these games in isolation. In the aggregate, I mean, this is also a stretch, by the way, in which Kim Pomeroy, some of these games are basically coin tosses. But this is also a stretch where Pomeroy's got them the underdog in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 games in a row. So this is also kind of the stretch where, basically, if you're going to turn the course, if you're going to turn the course of your season, if you're going to turn the narrative around your season in a different direction, it's kind of got to happen now. And I only kind of talk about this because, frankly, I was impressed with the way Indiana played against Penn State. I thought they would struggle more in that game than they did. And I was particularly impressed with how good they were in the second half, how good they were in long stretches. And Penn State came back into the game. And, frankly, you expect that. I think that's a Penn State team that's going to be in and around the NCAA tournament conversation all season. I think Ace Baldwin is really, really good. I think they've got some interesting pieces, like their big man Niederhauser, I think is a little bit underappreciated. And for Indiana to play the way it did when Penn State historically plays very well and very tough at the Palestra just impressed me. And so now I feel like for the first time in a little while, I'm sort of looking at, Indiana and wondering if this team may be able to start scratching its ceiling again, rather than after Chattanooga and Winthrop, when I'm watching those games and just thinking this looks like a team that, might get toppled over pretty easily once he gets back into conference play.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, you sound very bullish from where you were 2 weeks ago, like you said. Like I said, I just feel
fairness,
like
that's because of how unbullish I was 2 weeks ago. But yeah,
that might be true. I just feel like it's just one performance can't sort of overshadow like I said, the inconsistency of the first sort of full 2 months of the season. But they'd have, like you said, this over the next 7 games, you go 5-1, 4-2. The 5-1 maybe more convincing in terms of the competition level they're facing with some of the road games too. But then I think you're sort of able to say like, well, this is where we've learned and we're improving. Whereas I feel like you've seen the sort of like 1 step forward, 2 steps back with this team too much this season to sort of buy one win. It's not going to get me to buy stock in this team yet, just because of what we've seen.
No, I get that. I think that the only question I have, and listen, that there's people love to say, well, hindsight's 2020. It's like, yeah, that's the point. Like sometimes you need hindsight, like you need the context of what happens next. If Indiana comes out Wednesday night and lays an egg at home against a pretty middling Southern Cal team, then that Penn State win won't really have meant much. But I could also see a world, as somebody who's covered this kind of season before with Indiana, where it just like November and December just seemed really calamitous, and then they kind of started to pull things together in January. There's an extent to which I look at Rutgers and Penn State, and I feel like it's possible, not a guarantee by any means, but possible. We're seeing the sorts of signs of a team that might be assembling into something better, into something more consistent. But again, that only gets borne out with time. Like if in 3 weeks we're sitting here and Indiana's gone 3-4, then or 3-3 or worse. I mean, 3-3 isn't like the end of the world, but like let's say Indiana goes 2-4 in these next 6 games, then Indiana's in trouble and nothing's really been accomplished. And we just only can know that with the benefit of the context of what actually happens. I just thought the Penn State game, I thought there were reasons to be optimistic or at least sort of curious about this team coming out of Penn State. Let's move over to football before we finish. Things have been happening kind of at I think a pretty steady sort of trickle here from a portal perspective. Indiana did add a commitment in who I think hasn't technically signed yet in Jacob Bell, the quarterback from Illinois. But more than that, Indiana's been very busy in the portal. We've seen Indiana add at corner. We've seen Indiana add at receiver. We've seen Indiana obviously now add 2 quarterbacks. They have, I think it's fair to say, reinforced the offensive line between do we know how to pronounce the Ohio State transfer's last name? I don't want to get it wrong.
No, Zen, right? That's his first name, so that's what I'm going with.
Yeah, I think it's Zen Michalski, but obviously, and then Khalil Benson and Lewis Moore, who Indiana fans will know well, running it back there. Restocking the running back room. I don't think this team is done by any means, but it does feel like, to Curt Cignetti's credit and his staff's credit, they have been, I think, pretty efficient in addressing a lot of this team's needs thus far, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some interesting things. I mean, you mentioned the cornerbacks or defensive backs that they signed. They signed one yesterday. What was it? Ryland Gandy, is that right?
Gandy from
Pittsburgh. And so and then they signed Knighton from Northern Illinois. I don't expect there to be there will be competition, but D'Angelo Pons is sort of like, written in Sharpie on the starting lineup or in the depth chart. I thought Jameer Johnson played really well, so I would expect them, with the portal window being closed now, they brought back Sharp as well. That's a really crowded room. You kind of, both of the cornerbacks they signed have 2 years of eligibility left. Is it sort of a succession plan? Is it sort of somebody's moving to safety because at least Moore is the only safety they sign, and they really do need some safety help? I think that's sort of something to watch sort of going forward. And then obviously the offensive line, I think is, Zen obviously, you put, you assume is going to be kind of in that spot for Trey Wiedig. How does that interior shake out? Is Bray Lynch sort of destined to move to center and Khalil Benson at guard? Or do they do something different? Benson obviously has experience at tackle. Do they sort of open up the competition and see what's what? So I think there's some interesting things to watch with some of the guys that they signed sort of in this latest run.
I would at safety keep an eye on Christian Harrison, who's Rodney Harrison's son. He's a transfer from Tennessee. If I'm not mistaken, he's visited Indiana. I think Indiana's really serious there. We'll see where kind of that goes. I think the other thing that I find interesting, because you talk about that cornerback room being really stocked. Part of me does wonder, because we haven't seen Indiana go as heavy in the linebacker area, which tells you probably at least in part they like Isaiah Jones, they like Elijah Hardy next to Aiden Fisher. Part of me also just wonders, are they going to put more corners on the field? They were pretty reliably, sort of 2 corners, 2 safeties, and a rover this season. That was depending who was at safety and who was at rover kind of shifted around a little bit, but that was kind of the way home, more or less. I wonder if they might be thinking a little bit more about across the board man coverage, in which case you would probably put a corner in. You'd have a nickel corner on the field a lot more often rather than a safety in sort of a rover position. It just strikes me that unless they just absolutely did not like what they got from Jameer Johnson this season, which to me that seems kind of harsh. I think Johnson played pretty well, like you do. I don't think he was as good as D'Angelo Pons, but I thought he was a perfectly, sort of a perfectly functional.
Nothing I saw made me think that was the priority in the portal, that they needed a second.
So I just wonder if I wonder if this signals some kind of almost personnel shift, that they feel like they want to go in a direction of maybe it's more like man coverage across the board. The front 6 is the front 6, maybe a little bit more blitzing, and just trusting coverage essentially. But if you're going to trust coverage, then you're going to need obviously more talented sort of you're going to need more talented, sort of individual covers, man-to-man coverage corners, or I guess defensive backs, but generally those players are cornerbacks. I just wonder if maybe it's more of a shift in philosophy of saying we're going to try and do this a little bit more next year compared to what Indiana did this year in its defensive backfield. And so maybe there's not quite as much need for safety because they're actually going to be playing fewer, what we would call, if we had to classify them as one position or the other, fewer safeties and more corners at one time.
Well, or they could just be redefining sort of what the rover position is for next year as That's more of a cover spot than it's that position, but just slightly different. But like you said, something's got to shake out because you can't have 5 starting corners. You got to have some use for these guys to get them to all stick around. And so, maybe there's some attrition after but I think it's something to follow. You got to have because they've got, the Pitt kid started all last season. Northern Illinois kid started a lot of last season too. So these are starting kind of, and that's where the resources. So obviously, you got to have a plan in place for it.
Yeah, I think you also mentioned in terms of the possibility of a, some kind of succession plan. It also might be. I think Jameer Johnson is done after this season, if I'm not mistaken. And
Pons will be in the draft probably next year. So
you have to consider the possibility that D'Angelo Pons is going to the NFL draft after next season. So this could be that a little bit too, and just not wanting to leave yourself in a situation where you're only counting on young guys to develop. The other one that we can talk about Fernando Mendoza if you want. I think there's a lot about Fernando Mendoza that feels like it just sort of speaks for itself, if you know what I mean. Just in the sense that he's, 3-time ACC Player of the Week last season, passed for 3,000 yards, I thought it was interesting that he cut his attempts per interception number from like, I think 24.3 per attempt his redshirt freshman year to 64.3 per attempt last season, despite facing a ton of pressure. Cal did not put a good offensive line in front of him. So I think there's a lot of reason to believe that Mendoza can come in and be a really successful signal caller. But I'm as intrigued by what they added at running back and to a certain extent at wide receiver. We don't know exactly what they're going to do between Tyler Morris and Mekhi Jackson. Are those guys going to move to the slot? I think Morris does have a little bit of a slot receiver profile. Jackson played more at the boundary for App State, but that doesn't mean he can't move inside. I just think they've added, I really like Roman Hemby. I really like that ad. Lee Beebe seems interesting, the UAB transfer. We knew they had proven receivers, and we knew that, broadly speaking, they at least had the bones of a good offensive line. They've added to that now. But it is interesting. I have been interested, I guess I should say, by the pieces they've added at skill positions, because I think that we talk so much about they're going to need to redo the running back room. They're going to need to figure out slot receiver. Those were both really important positions within the offense, as you'd imagine, last year. They've added some intriguing pieces for me there.
Yeah, out last night, they signed 17 sort of transfers. I think that number includes E.J. Williams sort of withdrawing, and 6 of them are at skill positions. So, I mean, obviously, they felt like they had a lot of work to do because they did. I mean, obviously, you lose Miles Price, you lose Keyshawn Williams, who, were sort of integral to the success. Obviously, you mentioned the running backs. They restocked. I think, with Jackson, really sort of impressive numbers for App State last year. His sort of the explosive plays numbers really jumped out to me in particular. Did play the slot sort of full time for St. Francis, and then moved sort of the boundary. So kind of, I think a guy that gives you versatility. You don't have to sort of, pigeonhole him into one spot. If he's capable of learning them all, I mean, you could really kind of, I think, and that's what they like. They like to pick mismatches, sort of design plays for guys. And he's a guy that I think you could immediately see them coming up a lot of different stuff for. And same way with the running backs, who I think are both really effective in the backfield catching the ball. And so you kind of see, I think, what they want to do sort of with this offense to sort of, give teams really, really, really a lot of problems with sort of, how they line up.
Any other business? I mean, we're kind of coming toward the end here, but I don't want to skip anything you think we need to talk about.
No, I'm good.
Well said. He's Mike Niziolek. I'm Zach Osterman. We'll probably be back with a post-game show tomorrow night. We haven't done one of those in a while after IU Southern Cal. That's a 7:00 tip on the Big Ten Network. I was surprised when I realized it was at 7. Just in the sense I assumed they would try to make those old Pac-12 teams. They try to get them into the 8:30 and 9:00 slots, but TV is TV. So we'll leave it there for now. He's Mike Niziolek. I'm Zach Osterman. This has been Mind Your Banners for January 7th, 2025. It's been wonderful to talk to all of you again. Thank you so much for listening. We will be back soon.